And we are live here on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter doing a board session, something a little bit different this week. I'm trying to test some different things out as we get through the content plugging. I like to mix things up. And what I got going on today, if you are tuning in, is I'm going to run through the Week 13 slate and give you guys some quick hitter thoughts on all of the matchups. I think I'm going to leave the night game and the Monday game out of it because we have plenty to talk about. But just some quick thoughts on each team from each of the games. I'm going to do it board session based. Usually do that in my office, but again, trying some different things out. So if you are tuning in, stick with me here as we get through some Week 13 thoughts here.
To win, no fear to give. I feel but I can't forgive. I go all in this time, yeah, I won't regret. I'll pick the best on trip, they don't understand. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win, oh, play to win. I play to win, yeah, I play to win. I play to win.
All right, some thoughts on each of the games, starting off with the Colts versus the Texans. So board session based, we'll start with the Colts. So with the Colts, I think Carson Wentz is a guy you can stream this week if you need to stream a quarterback. I know we got Jalen Hurts, who is questionable right now. We got some other guys that are on a bye. The Texans are the 13th when it comes to points per game to the QB position. I think he's a good streamer. QB 11 on the year right now. 9 out of 12 of his games have been multi-touchdown games. 4 games above 20 fantasy points. So I think we've seen plenty of games this year from Carson Wentz that have actually been really good for fantasy. And I know we'll probably see a lot of Jonathan Taylor and him doing a bunch in this game. But seeing as though he's had some weeks with a decent ceiling, I think he's a good stream this week. The major question I also have regarding this game is for this guy. Michael Pittman Jr. and the question marks next to his name say plenty. I'm a big fan of what he's done this year. Personally, I'm wondering, is this a bounce back game for Michael Pittman Jr.? If you look at some 3-week splits out of this guy, weeks 7 through 9, he was the wide receiver 2 overall during that span. So obviously he was having some really nice games. The production was great for that 3 set of games. And then we go 3 weeks later, weeks 10 through 12, the wide receiver 36. So 2 very different stories, very Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of Michael Pittman Jr. I think the fact that we've seen plenty of these games where he's had 20 plus fantasy points, I think he's still a weekly play. I know he's been down the last couple of games, but when looking at guys who have seen multi-week productions, I think Michael Pittman Jr. is shown to be that guy. So I'm hoping that this game is a bounce back game. We'll shift over to the Texans now. And if we look at the wide receiver position, I'm always going to talk about my guy here. So Brandon Cooks. So what I saw earlier, the Colts are bottom 7 when it comes to the points per game given up to the running back position. So let's say David Johnson is out of the mix for this game. I know he's questionable, so you kind of have to see. There's been a bunch of guys on the Texans that are dealing with some sort of illness. Cooks is one of them, so keep your eye on that. But let's say David Johnson doesn't play, and we have Rex Burkhead. I'm still not interested in plugging either one of these guys because the Colts are good against the run. I was listening to Mike Clay, who mentioned that Brandon Cooks and Nico Collins both have a plus matchup in this game. That being said, I think Brandon Cooks seeing his production this season is a good play. Week 6 versus the Colts, so they already played once this season. Brandon Cooks had 9 catches for 89 yards on 13 targets. He had 17.9 fantasy points that week versus the Colts, who he sees again. Mike Clay also noted 17 touchdowns to the wide receiver position, which is the most in the league. So I think that if Cooks is good, so make sure you keep an eye on it because he has some sort of illness going on. If he's good to play, could be a nice day for Brandon Cooks. Anybody else? I don't know if I'm confident plugging them in. The deepest of leagues, we're still waiting on that Nico Collins day. Maybe it'll come, but again, I think Brandon Cooks is the play in this game. Got my guys Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry chilling with me today. The next game to talk about is the Vikings versus the Detroit Lions. So we'll start things off with the Vikings, and somebody that I like in this game is Kirk Cousins. That's a D. Don't have the best handwriting, but Kirk Cousins I like in this matchup. 6 games above 21 fantasy points. He's had 4 straight multi-touchdown games. He's also had 4 games this season with 3 touchdowns. So I think seeing Kirk Cousins, again, if it seems like year after year, no matter what he does, he's like not the sexy option to talk about. But there is upside there. When you have a 3-touchdown game and you've done that 4 times and you see a plus matchup versus the Detroit Lions, I think it's a good matchup this week. Also, everybody's going to be playing him. But Alexander Madison's got a plus matchup this week. You're going to play him. Everybody went and rushed the waiver wire if he was available and made that move. The Lions give up the 4th most points per game to the running back position. But I think this kind of goes hand in hand because I feel like both are good plays. But I think knowing that Madison is a starter, I don't think that, the Vikings are going to have their game plan focused on Alexander Madison winning them this game. I think he'll get plenty of touches, but that kind of goes to why I also think Kirk Cousins is going to have a good day and throw the ball. Other side of the ball, talk briefly about 2 guys from the Lions. One is going to be the running back, and then a sleeper that I like. So the running back we'll talk about, he was the other big waiver wire guy. I just looked. He's now up above 80% rostership on ESPN. So obviously everybody was smart about that with DeAndre Swift not playing. Good matchup against the Vikings, who are a pretty poor run defense. 20 total touches last game versus Chicago when DeAndre Swift was out of it. That being said, we've seen plenty of games where he's been pretty decent for fantasy. Jamal Williams, he had 25 points, obviously week 1, 14.7 week 3, 13.3 in his last game. He's a guy that is going to get a bunch of touches. We see him used in both the rushing and the passing game, and I think this will be another game that shows that. Seeing that he had 20 total touches last week should give you confidence that he's going to touch the ball a lot this week. So he's a definite play. The other guy I want to talk about briefly might be more of a deep league suggestion or a deep league look, might be a DFS look as well. Josh Reynolds. So the Vikings give up the 2nd most points per game to the wide receiver position. Nobody has really established themselves as the wide receiver 1 for the Lions. We've seen games where Khalif Raymond looks good or has a decent week. We've seen weeks where Amon-Ra St. Brown gets a decent amount of targets, but no one's really been like the guy. And I'm not saying Josh Reynolds will be the guy, but seeing last week, he had a really nice game against Chicago. 5 targets. He had a touchdown. He had 16 fantasy points. We know that there's a connection between Jared Goff and Josh Reynolds because they played together. They played together in the past. They played together on the Rams. So DFS, deep leagues, I'd be taking a quick look at Josh Reynolds, especially seeing that the Vikings give up a decent amount to the wide receiver for fantasy purposes. Might be a guy to keep your eye on in this matchup. All right, we'll get to the next game on the slate. So Giants versus the Dolphins. So we'll start off with the Giants here. First pointer, first quick hitter for the Giants is that Saquon Barkley needs passing volume in this game. He has not been rushing the ball well. That's just a fact as of late. People have said he doesn't look like he has the same sort of spark and pop to his step and things like that. He just hasn't had a lot of good rushing days. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. He's been injured. He's come back. The O-line, whatever you want to attribute that to. Glennon is at quarterback this week. So Daniel Jones will not be playing. But we also have a couple guys that are doubtful. So those guys being Shepard, Kadarius Toney. So some people may be looking like, hey, might be a Kenny Golladay day or something along those lines. I think Saquon needs a lot of passes in this game. And I think he needs it for a few reasons. Obviously, one, for his fantasy relevance, because we've seen games in the past where he's had 5 or 6 catches this season. And we know that his, phenomenal rookie season, he was getting a ton of passing work. And that's what helped him be very effective for fantasy, but also for the Giants. And I think knowing that the Giants are going to be potentially without Shepard and Toney in this one, I think using Saquon in the passing game is going to be key. So for him to be a good fantasy asset this week, I think he needs like 6 catches plus. And I actually think he's going to get a lot of looks. So I'm going to be bold and say that Saquon gets 8 targets this week, and hopefully he catches and makes the most out of them. On the other side of the ball, got a couple guys to talk about when it comes to the Dolphins. So we'll jump into that. So the first thing I want to mention, Tua. So Tua's accuracy has been great the last 2 games. And it's not like he's only throwing the ball, 15 times or something like that. He's had both games the past 2 weeks with 30 passing attempts plus, so over 30 passing attempts. The last 2 games, 81.8% in week 11, 87.1% in week 12. So the accuracy is really good right now, and that's helping his team be effective. One of the guys that's on absolute fire is the rookie. Jalen Waddle, who I wish I had more shares of because I have 0, I think. In 15 fantasy leagues. It feels like a crime because this guy has been on fire. I was too low on him, to be honest. I didn't say he was a bust or was going to be a dud, but he's been great. Back-to-back games with 20.6 and 28.7. I don't care what the matchup is. You are playing him every single week. Plus, the targets are really nice there. 19 targets across the last 2 games. That's a great sign for a guy that we know has a ton of speed, can make plays, and be really effective. So Jalen Waddle has been great. The last guy I'm going to mention, and he had back-to-back good weeks, and he broke that every other week streak, is Myles Gaskin. So I'm going to say Myles Gaskin is good play in this one, and I'll make it pretty brief here, but the Giants give up the 3rd most points per game to the running back position. He has been the RB5 across the last 2 weeks, so small sample size, but he's been good. We know he catches the ball. We know that Myles Gaskin catches the ball, but the good sign here has been the rushing volume. So 23 and 16 carries the last 2 games. That's a really good sign. Now, we're not just looking at him and saying he's only going to rush the ball 7 to 10 times. Hopefully he catches 5 passes. That's not the case the last 2 games. Now he's getting a lot of rushing work. Phillip Lindsay's kind of creeping in there a little bit, but seeing that he's rushing the ball a lot and he has the pass-catching ability, Myles Gaskin, good play against the Giants who give up a lot to the running back position. The efficiency does need to go up, though. He hasn't been rushing the greatest out of those games, but I think a lot of signs point in the direction that Myles Gaskin is a guy to trust again in this game. All right, so the next matchup, we'll get to the Buccaneers versus the Falcons. Got to do the reset on the board every time. So the guy I want to talk about on the Buccaneers is the GOAT himself, Tom Brady. He needs a bounce back. He needs a bounce back game. Now, he hasn't been terrible, especially when we're looking at just the NFL itself and his production. But from a fantasy perspective, QB 11 the last 3 weeks. And when you look at a 12-team league, that's a starter. Nothing crazy, but 13 points, 19.28, and then 11.24. So 2 games out of the last 3 weeks under 14 fantasy points has not been ideal for Brady. One of the things that needs to change for him, and hopefully he can shape up in this Falcons game, is the interception. So he's got 4 interceptions in the last 3 games. They leaned on Lenny Fournette, Lombardi Lenny, last game, and he had that explosive, huge touchdown day. So they didn't have to have this huge aerial attack because of it. But I think Brady is going to be a little bit more geared up to be on track this week. The Falcons give up one of the most points versus the quarterback position. So I think Brady is due for a good bounce back, seeing that he's been scoring low for fantasy and seeing as though that the Falcons give up a ton to the quarterback position. I don't think we're going to see this team turn into a big Leonard Fournette is going to be the leader of this team sort of outlook. So look for a Brady bounce back. On the other side of the ball, I'm going to look at the Falcons. I'm going to talk about a guy that might be a sleeper or maybe just a potential flex play based on what you need. Russell Gage, I think, is a guy you can flex. Kind of depends on who you would be juggling between him and who for that flex play. But he's a guy right now that's been seeing some decent volume. He had a good game last week, 18.2 fantasy points last week, caught 6 passes on 7 targets for 62 yards and a touchdown. That's a good sign. If you look at the last couple of games, what the targets have been like, there's only really been one game where he didn't get a ton of work. Otherwise, he did have that one game, 2 weeks ago where he had the goose egg. But listen to these targets, 8, 3, 8, and 7. Now, Matt Ryan hasn't exactly been a stud for fantasy, a stud in the NFL at all. But seeing that the targets are there and seeing that Russell Gage actually, if you look at the stats the last couple of years, he gets a lot of red zone looks. So I think he's a potential flex play knowing that he's going to get a bunch of looks. He can get some decent yardage in a game. And I think seeing the volume the last 4 games is a good sign. Plus, we know Patterson's a stud. They don't lean on the run too much because they can't, the Falcons. Also, when you play the Bucs, you're going to have to pass the ball a ton. So look for Matt Ryan to be airing it out a lot. If it hits his receivers or it doesn't, that's another story. But I think that there's going to be a lot of passing going on in this game to make Gage an interesting flex play against the Buccaneers. All right, we got the Eagles versus the Jets. This next game to talk about here. And for the Eagles, I've suggested it before. And I'm hoping that I'm right this time. Never was a massive Miles Sanders guy, but I actually think that this is going to be a Miles Sanders game this week. Jalen Hurts may or may not play. We don't know unless it has broken while I've been on the stream, the news. We don't know if he's playing or not. That changes the dynamic of the offense a little bit. The Jets, looking at what they give up for fantasy, they give up the most points per game to the running back position. So not like if I was looking for a 3 or a 2, the Jets give up the most points per game to the running back position. So I think that's a good sign for Miles Sanders, who's had some decent yardage the last 2 games. So we've seen 2 weeks ago after he came back from injury, he got 16 carries right away, 16 for 94. Last week, didn't get a ton of carries, but he was productive with what he got. 9 carries for 64. So 16 for 94, 9 for 64. A lot of numbers that seem similar right there. So good rushing days. I think seeing that this game might be a bump in his overall volume, plus seeing that the Jets just give up a ton to the running back position, I think it's going to be a Miles Sanders week. I think Miles Sanders ended up being a guy that busts that projection. I would say booms that projection. So my prediction here, Miles Sanders week against the Jets. If he scores, it's going to be a nice day. Other side of the ball. Got to talk about Elijah Moore, or else I wouldn't be myself. This is an L, not an extra I. Elijah Moore. So after that streak, so let's talk about the pre-Zach Wilson coming back streak. Weeks 8 through 11, he was the wide receiver 1 in fantasy. Not a top 10. He was the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy, Elijah Moore. He had a 9.3 fantasy week last week when Zach Wilson came back. And a lot of people question, what is it going to look like in this offense when Zach Wilson comes back? You know, a lot of people have knocked their connection, but I remember in the preseason, them two were very, very well connected during camp. That's why Elijah Moore was like one of the preseason all-stars, because we just saw highlight after highlight, and it was from Zach Wilson. So in that game with Zach Wilson, he only scored 9.3 fantasy points, but the good sign was 8 targets. It's not like Zach Wilson came back and only gave him 5 looks or something along those lines, but Elijah Moore still saw 8 targets. Here's the reason you flex him. Again, it depends on who you are juggling this position with. The reason I still think he is a flex, even though the matchup against the Eagles is actually a tougher matchup for wide receivers, I think the reason you flex him is because of this. These are 2 of the games we saw recently. 27.4, 29.6. The ceiling is there. The ability of the player is there. The targets are there. Will the production follow? Will there be a lot of efficiency? That's the question. But when you see the ceiling of a player, I think he has to be flexed, because it's not like we're talking about a guy who's only scored 12, 13, 14 points weekly. We're talking about a guy that scored this amount of fantasy points very recently. And I think that the offense is going to continue as a whole to try to get this guy involved, because what's the best way to get young players more adapt to the game and develop them is to give them the game experience. How do you give them the game experience? By giving them the targets and getting them involved. So I think that the offensive coordinator, I think Robert Saleh, I think getting him involved as much as possible in the game is actually a big part of their game plan, because they've seen these weeks. These are fantasy weeks, but they've also been very productive NFL weeks. So that's why I still think Elijah Moore, even in an iffy matchup, is a guy you can play. All right, next one, we got the Cardinals versus my Bears. Exciting day for Andy Dalton and the Bears. Obviously, wish it was the rookie Justin Fields, but it is what it is. So for the Cardinals, first guy I'll talk about, or the only guy I'm really going to mention in this, is Zach Ertz. So, I don't want to just base this off of one matchup, one game, because he had a huge game last week. But just mentioning it, 28.8 fantasy points last week for Zach Ertz. He had 2 touchdowns in that game on 8 catches. I think a big reason why he was so involved, obviously, was that they had no DeAndre Hopkins. And I'm not entirely sure if Kyler is going to be playing or to what level he will be playing. I'm not sure if Hopkins is going to play either. The one thing that I will mention, though, that I've been thinking about a lot is that Bears, maybe without their star linebacker, Roquan Smith. What does that give up? Probably a ton through the middle of the field. Zach Ertz being the tight end might be the area of the field he's attacking. Now, you might say, that's a good spot for Rondale Moore to, be in a slot and be explosive in, or, something along those lines. But Zach Ertz, I think, is another good play this week. I think that if Hopkins misses, he gets a huge bump in this matchup versus the Bears. If Hopkins does play, I wouldn't assume that Hopkins is going to come into this game after being banged up and get 15 targets. I think he's going to play at a limited capacity. So I think Zach Ertz is going to see, again, back-to-back weeks of some good volume and be good against the Bears. Bears, I got 2 mentions. I got to mention at least 2, that being my home team here. But first one is going to be Darnell Mooney. Must start weekly. until anything changes with Darnell Mooney, he goes in your lineup every week. I don't care if it's Andy Dalton, Justin Fields, Nick Foles, whoever the quarterback is, you have to play Darnell Mooney until something changes, because this is what he's done recently. The last 3 games, 20.6 fantasy points, 23.1, and then 17.5. So these are really, really good fantasy weeks for the wide receiver. He's actually being heavily targeted. I think he's one of the most targeted players for his target percentage goes for the wide receiver position. I think he's in the top 10 for target percentage for wide receivers. The other huge thing for him is the high yardage. So 121 and 123 receiving yards the last 2 games back to back. Huge part of this offense. He looks great right now. He's getting heavy targets. He's getting tons of yards. He's a must play until something changes. It's just as simple as that. He's been one of the best wide receivers for fantasy the last 3 weeks, and that's just a fact based off his play. The other guy I'm going to mention briefly, and he was on the injury report, but he is not anymore, is another tight end on the other side of the ball. So Cole Kmet, guy I've liked since the draft, Notre Dame guy. Being a Notre Dame and a Bears fan, he's got a soft spot somewhere here. But Cole Kmet is a guy that the last 3 weeks, 2 of them have been really nice fantasy weeks. So one of those weeks he had 14.7, the other one 14.5. So very similar weeks. The good thing about Cole Kmet lately is that 2 things have changed for him. The 2 things that have changed for him has been that out of those 2 weeks, so the 2 good games out of the last 3, the targets have been really good. The yardage has been really good. So that was a big question mark for me going into the year when it comes to Cole Kmet. I thought to myself, the targets might be there. He might get sniped in the end zone because of Jimmy Graham still being there. But the yardage was always pretty low. Like, he was having these games where he caught like 4 balls for like 30 yards or something like that. Now, seeing that he's catching passes for like the 60-ish and the 80-ish range for receiving yards, that's a good sign. So a lot of signs point to Cole Kmet being a guy that could be a streaming tight end, depending on who else you have, or if you have somebody in a bye week or somebody injured. A lot of good signs. And what I look for personally for the tight end position is target share, and he's been getting a decent amount now. I just hope that Jimmy Graham stops sniping him in the red zone. Get to the next game on a slate. Got the Chargers versus the Bengals. So I'm going to mention both wide receivers for the Chargers, and that being Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. 2 different things, though. So Keenan Allen, tale of 2 people right here. So here's the first guy. So both being Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, weeks 1 through 6. Wide receiver 25 before the bye. Keenan Allen, weeks 8 through 12. Wide receiver 5, I believe he was. Let me check on that really quick. 8 through 12. Three, actually. Wide receiver 3. So that being Keenan Allen, tale of 2 different people. He's been on fire lately. The last handful of games, 11, 13, 11, 13, and then 10 targets. So the targets have been great. Targets coming from Justin Herbert versus somebody else in the league is probably also a little bit of a difference. So again, 1 through 6, weeks 1 through 6, wide receiver 25, weeks 8 through 12, wide receiver 3. So I'm hoping that this guy continues to be on this sort of wave. The other guy has had games where He's had 20.7 and 7.9. So I think 2 weeks ago he had 20.7. Just recently at 7.9. You don't know what you're going to get out of Mike Williams. I would say my suggestion when it comes to him is that based off of your matchup, that's what you have to factor in when it comes to playing him or not. Because if you're chasing a matchup, we've seen these huge days out of Mike Williams. You can chase those points. But if you're in a tight matchup and you want a safer player, then you might bench him. So I guess it just depends on what you're looking for on a given week, because we see a lot more of these games lately, the 7-ish games, in comparison to the 20-point games that we saw at the beginning of the season. So really big dart throw. The ceiling is super high, I think. The floor is super low. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for in the matchup. So on the other side of the ball with the Bengals, just want to talk about their wide receivers a little bit. Chase and Higgins. So the Chargers are the second worst against the wide receiver matchup as far as playing the wide receivers. So I typically say that a team is, gives up the most. These guys give up the second least against the wide receiver position. Chase has kind of cooled off a bit. He's been in the 13-ish range or below the last 4 games. Higgins, on the other hand, has had a just okay season, nothing crazy. The last week was his best game. Last week, T. Higgins had 23.4 fantasy points. That was his best day. For these two guys to be good this week, I think 2 things have to happen. I think Joe Burrow's passing volume has to be high for these two guys to be effective this week. Week 7 through 9, we saw Joe Burrow being a high volume passing quarterback. We saw games for these 3 weeks where he had 38, 34, and 40 passing attempts. If that's the sort of day that this game is going to be, then you have more confidence in these guys. If it's a day where this guy goes off, though, because the Chargers, I think, are not as good against the running backs, then it's going to be a day where probably only one of these guys goes off for fantasy, if that. If Mixon comes out and scores 3 touchdowns again or has one of those weeks, then Burrow won't have to have that high volume of passing. So I'm hoping that in this game, if you're playing one of these guys, that this guy, Joe Burrow, is throwing the ball again from 34 to 40 times for these guys both to be effective, because they're both talented, both good players. But again, sometimes the game script is effective of it, and sometimes if one guy goes off, the other one doesn't. And that's just been the case for the Bengals this season. Next is the Jaguars versus the Rams. Gotten through a bunch of games without this falling so far, so hopefully we're good. Hopefully we're good. So Trevor Lawrence's performances lately cap everything in the offense as far as pass catchers go. Because, and I'm not saying he's a bad quarterback. I'm not trying to say anything like that. I don't think he's set up appropriately. I don't think he's also performed to what we expected. I think it's a mix of things. But Lawrence has thrown only 2 touchdowns across the last 5 games. Not good for fantasy when you have Marvin Jones Jr. or Laviska Shenault, or I think it's or the tight end position there. 2 touchdowns in the last 5 games limits the ceiling for all pass catchers, because it's just not one of those offenses. He doesn't pass for a ton of yardage. That hurts it as well. So because of this, I'm not playing any wide receivers versus the Rams. I mean, it's going to be a day where they're probably going to have to throw the ball a ton, especially if Robinson is banged up, because I think he's still dealing with that heel. He's probably the only guy you'd play if you have him, just because you kind of have to. Running back position is pretty thin. Got a bunch of guys banged up. So if Robinson plays, you kind of have to play him. He does see some nice volume weekly, but he's the only guy I'm going to play because of Lawrence limiting the ceiling of all pass catchers. Other side of the ball, I think a good play is Van Jefferson. So I think Van Jefferson's a good play this week. OBJ is questionable. Will he play? Will he not play? We're not sure. If he does play, is he limited? I'd be thinking about that as well. Van Jefferson just saw his season high in targets this past week with 9. He scored a touchdown. I think he had a touchdown taken away as well. So he could have had 2. So he had 18.3 last game. We've seen games this year where Van Jefferson has had like 16. He had a 21-point game. So the ceiling is there. He can have these big weeks. The big thing, though, is that the volume is up. And that's what you look for in a flex. This guy can make big plays. He can extend the field. He can take one catch for 60 yards. Seeing now that, Robert Woods is out of the picture due to the torn ACL, seeing that OBJ is banged up. He might not play. He might play injured. We're not sure. Van Jefferson's a good flex this week against the Jaguars. I think a lot of signs just continue to point in a good direction. It's going to come down to if he gets 10 targets, what does he do with those targets? Is he efficient? Is he catching them all? Is he making the plays? But again, looking at a guy who's just a flex play, I think he's one of my starts of the week this week. I had a short video yesterday where I dropped that info. One of my starts of the week is Van Jefferson. Next on the list, we got Washington versus the Raiders. Logan Thomas is my start of the week. So this is the reason why Logan Thomas is my tight end start of the week. Guy was a top 5 tight end last year. We know this. He was very good last year. He had a ton of volume, had a lot of nice games. Opening up the season, out of the first 3 games that he wasn't hurt at all, he scored in 2 of those games. I believe it was weeks 1 and 3 he scored. Then he was injured in week 4. Then he missed a ton of time. Coming straight off of injury, 6 targets immediately from that game, and then he had a touchdown call back. I actually had a hot take on a Monday podcast. I'm like, Logan Thomas is scoring today. And he did, but it was taken away. So I was almost in the running for a victory lap. I laced up the shoes. I was ready for it. The Raiders give up the second most points per game to the tight end position as well. So seeing that a guy gets a lot of looks in the end zone, he can score. Seeing that he saw 6 targets straight away coming back from injury where he missed tons of weeks, that's a good sign. And then seeing the Raiders give up the second most points per game to the tight end position, Logan Thomas, I think, is going to finish the week as a top 5 guy. That's one of my takes of the week, one of my starts of the week, Logan Thomas for the tight end position. Other side of the ball, another great start, another must start that we all probably are guilty of not talking about enough in preseason because we're worried about the sophomores in the system too much. But Hunter Renfrow is a must start. Hunter Renfrow to me is a must-start player this week. He plays Washington, who gives up the 4th most points per game to the wide receiver position. After the bye, so weeks 9 through 12, he's been the wide receiver 10. So again, after the bye, weeks 9 through 12, he's been the wide receiver 10. He's averaged 16.2 fantasy points during that time. I think the volume is solid. He's had 9 targets exactly in 3 out of 4 of his last games. So if it's a typical day for Hunter Renfrow, he's seeing 9 targets on the dot. And seeing a guy who's been hot for that amount of time, so it's not the entire season where he's been having this sort of volume, this sort of production, but he's been good this year. He's been really good. And seeing consistency the last couple of weeks for him, this is a great game for Hunter Renfrow. So rest of season, unless you are absolutely stacked at the wide receiver position, to me, Hunter Renfrow is a must start, especially this week versus the Washington football team. I think Hunter Renfrow is going to finish this week as one of the better wide receivers. We got a couple more. I think we got 2 more games left on the slate, and then I'll let you guys go if by chance you're still watching this here. So Ravens Steelers. So I got a big question for Mark Andrews here. Can Mark Andrews catch Travis Kelce this year in fantasy? That's one of my biggest questions. Andrews has been the tight end 1 the last 3 weeks. So if we combine the last 3 weeks for fantasy, he's been the tight end 1. Right now, he's only 13.4. 13.4 points behind Travis Kelce. Interesting fun fact. At this point last year, I think I had that somewhere around here. I do. The gap last year, weeks 1 through 12, between Kelce and the tight end 2, who was Darren Waller at the time, was 65.8. So again, last year, the difference between Travis Kelce and the tight end 2 was 65.8. This year, through 12 weeks, the difference between Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews is only 13.4 fantasy points. So I'm curious to see if Mark Andrews continues to get this ball rolling. Can he catch Travis Kelce and take that tight end 1 away from the guy who's had it the last handful of years? That's going to be very interesting to see. Talking about the other tight end for the Pittsburgh Steelers as well. Big Pat, you got to play. So Big Pat Freiermuth. Since the bye, weeks 8 through 12, he's been the tight end 1. So 8 through 12, tight end 1 for Big Pat Freiermuth. I tweeted this out earlier. He's had 5 touchdowns in his last 5 games total. So 5 total touchdowns across his last 5 games. He is second in red zone targets for the tight end position for the entire year. The rookie. That's a great sign. The volume's been there most weeks. I think he only had like 4 targets last game, but he's seen plenty of weeks recently where he's had like 7 targets. So seeing is that he gets a bunch of red zone looks. He usually gets some nice volume just in general. He's a must play. Unless you have Kelce or Andrews, I think he's right up there for a guy that can be a top 3 to 5 tight end rest of season, just based on the volume, based on the touchdown upside. The Ravens right now give up the 4th most points per game to the tight end position, even more to why Big Pat is a big play this week. Last one for the slate here. Last game we'll mention, 49ers versus Seattle. So 49ers versus Seattle. Made a video earlier this week. Elijah Mitchell is a league winner this year. And I know the term for some people is corny. And it's often made fun of a little bit because it's a kind of generic, like big term to use. But I actually really believe that Elijah Mitchell is a league winner this year. And what is a league winner? It's a guy that can consistently in the playoffs win you your weeks. I mean, if a guy's going to score 20 plus fantasy points consistently for your fantasy team in the playoffs, to me, that's a league winner because it just means the rest of the guys just have to hit their projections and maybe have one other guy go above. The good sign about Elijah Mitchell last week, I sat him in a league, but originally coming off of the ribs and the finger injuries, I thought that Jeff Wilson Jr. was going to split and it was going to be a committee between Elijah Mitchell and him. Here's how those touches looked. Elijah Mitchell, 32 touches, 70% of the snaps. Jeff Wilson Jr., 3 touches, 14% of the snaps. Huge difference. This guy is the workhorse in here. It's not a committee. It's not. The Seahawks give up the 2nd most points per game to the running back position. Huge play this week is Elijah Mitchell. He's going to see a ton of volume, and he's been great with the volume that he does get. And if we look at the rest of the year, we got Seattle this week, Cincinnati, Atlanta, Tennessee, and Houston. If we look at this set of games for Elijah Mitchell, here's how it looks for fantasy. So I already said Seattle gives up the second most points per game, Cincinnati the 8th, Atlanta the 5th, Tennessee is the asterisk because they're the 29th, so that's a tougher matchup for running backs, and then Houston the 10th. So out of this slate of games, 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 5 games for Elijah Mitchell give up the 10th most in some sort of order points per game to the running back position. That's why he's a league winner to me, as long as he stays healthy. Other side of the ball, the elephant in the room I have to bring up is DK Metcalf. Huge question marks for DK Metcalf. I am a huge DK Metcalf fan. I have the jersey in the garage. I think he is an awesome athlete. He can make some great plays. I think it's tough for me to bench him just because we've seen DK at his ceiling. We've seen DK have massive games where he takes the top off a defender and scores big touchdowns. He's like the new era TO. But since the bye, he's never scored 8 fantasy points. So weeks 10 through 12, he's been the wide receiver 73. I'm hoping that we finally see a bounce back game because Seattle in general has been terrible as far as fantasy goes because they're doing not what you expect them at all. Russell Wilson, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, Alex Collins. I mean, they're desperate enough to go out and get Adrian Peterson when he was just a dud for the Titans. I'm just hoping that Seattle gets back to doing things we expect them to do. And one of those things is DK Metcalf being DK Metcalf. Report came out the other day that said we need to get DK Metcalf the ball. No shit. And I tweeted, I said, water is wet, because that's all I could have said about that. Water is wet. DK Metcalf needs to get the ball. What I need this week to see, though, is above 8 fantasy points. He scored under that the last couple. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a DK day. And if it's not, then I really think going into the fantasy playoffs, then you got to start juggling. Do I even play this guy? I mentioned Van Jefferson, Hunter Renfrow, guys you would never expect to play over DK Metcalf. So after this week, if he doesn't get back to normal, I think we're going to start questioning, do I even start this guy? But that's it for the slate of games. If you tuned in at any point, appreciate that. It's going to be on YouTube if you missed any of it. So go to my YouTube page, hit that sub button while you're there. But the entire board session here for the Week 13 slate is on there. If you guys have any starts and sits questions, just tag me on Twitter. I'll answer them. I'm not going to be one of those guys, and power to those people that do, but I'm not going to be a guy who puts out a post saying, ask me. Just feel free at any time. I don't need to make a post for you guys to ask me stuff. I get tons and tons of questions throughout the week. So if you have any starts and sits, shoot them my way. But otherwise, we're getting close to those fantasy playoffs. Good luck. Power through. Hope you guys take home some ships. Thanks for tuning in, guys.